Hi, everyone. What a beautiful crowd. Y'all look lovely. It's nice to see such a full house for such an important subject. My name is Farmis. I'm with Southern Vermont for Palestine. And I want to thank especially the Latches Theater, John Potter, for hosting this event. And so in addition to Southern Vermont for Palestine, Jewish Voice for Peace of Vermont and New Hampshire also sponsored this event. As well as Action Corps. So just a little bit of housekeeping. We are also live streaming in case people are wondering why there's this technology up front. And there is, I don't know, some number of people that are joining us virtually. 23 people, apparently, are also joining us virtually. When we get to the Q&A, they will also be chiming in, so there'll be some rounds of questions from the non-live audience as well. And yeah, I think without further ado, I wanted to welcome up our local illuminary, Chuck Collins, to introduce our main speaker.
Thanks, Far. Thanks to all of you who organized this. Thanks also to Wyndham World Affairs Council for promoting it among your members. So Phyllis Bennis, our speaker tonight, I'm honored to introduce. She and I are colleagues at the Institute for Policy Studies. If you've never heard of the Institute for Policy Studies, we were founded in 1963 by Richard Barnett and Mark Raskin, the father of Jamie Raskin. You've probably heard of him lately. And it's truly an independent group of kind of campaigners and public scholars. I direct the program on inequality and inequality.org, and Phyllis directs the Institute's new internationalism program, which focuses on the Middle East, particularly Palestinian rights, U.S. militarism, and United Nations issues. She's also a fellow at the Transnational Institute based in Amsterdam, which was formed about 50 years ago when there was a certain president, and we thought that president was going to be cracking down and repressing certain institutions. And so we opened up an international base in Amsterdam, the Transnational Institute. In 2001, she helped to found the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, and more recently spent 6 years on the board of Jewish Voices for Peace. She still is an international advisor to Jewish Voices for Peace. She works with the anti-war movement. There's a lot of things that sort of get incubated at the Institute for Policy Studies and kind of spin off, you may not know, but like United for Peace and Justice and some of those coalitions. She has been addressed the UN General Assembly, has been an advisor to the UN, and was on the short list 2 times to be the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territory. She's written 11 books, including a book called Understanding Palestine and Israel Conflict. She's the author of Before and After, U.S. Foreign Policy and the War on Terror, and Challenging Empire, How People, Governments, and the UN Defy U.S. Power. Her new book, and the occasion of this visit, is called Understanding Palestine and Israel, and everyone's books is selling copies, and after the program, Phyllis will be happy to inscribe those to you. As a colleague, I get the privilege of hearing kind of week-to-week updates and analysis from Phyllis. We have a weekly staff meeting, and of course for the last 2 years, she's been a regular feature on kind of helping us understand what's happening. And I love her, both her rootedness in history, but also, she's just a great explainer. She's been on the ground, she knows the situation, so I think we're in for a treat. I asked her if she'd been to Brattleboro, and she actually couldn't remember. We don't take that personally. We just, we want her now, though, to remember Brattleboro. So let's give her a Brattleboro, Vermont welcome.
Can it be a little more to the side so I can sort of see my notes? Absolutely. The guy. Yeah. And then this, I will do like this, I think. Ah, there we go. Hi, everybody. What a friendly crowd. This is great. I'm really glad to be here, and I'm really grateful to you all for being here. I'm grateful to all the organizations that put it together. Thank you, Far and Chuck and the theater people. And really thank you to the Latches Theater, because, you know, aside from providing space, that's always a good thing. But these days, that's more than just a good thing. It's a risk that people take. And you have to be a little bit brave to do it. And I'm glad that people are still at least a little bit brave. So, you know, these last 18 months have been a really hard time, I think, for everybody who cares about Palestine, everybody who cares about humanity. And talking about it has been more difficult than ever. I've been doing this work for, well, significantly longer than I care to admit. And it's always hard. It's always harder than some other issues, right? It's always more contradictory and more complicated and whatever. But these days, it's harder than it has been. And I think the combination of what's happening in the Middle East as a region, not only in Palestine, but certainly in Gaza, where we see the rise of genocide, the combination of that with the global rise of authoritarianism in so many countries around the world, and the rise of authoritarianism and a near fascism here at home, makes everything harder. The risks are greater. You have to be braver. And what we saw this past Saturday is that an awful lot of people are rising to the need, rising to the occasion. And I think I was in, where was I? I was in New Haven for the protests. I've been moving around a lot, sorry, so I'm forgetting when I was where. I was in New Haven for the protest on Saturday, and it was great. It was, you know, it had its contradictions. There should have been more young people there, it's, you know, whatever. But like everywhere else, it was a statement of, we are here and we will not be silent. We will not be silent. And that's huge. And that went on across the country. I think the total is somewhere like 1,700 protests on that Saturday all across the country. And everywhere I go, people are telling us, this was more than we had ever had. Somebody that was at the event in Greenfield was talking about being at the event in a little town I had actually never heard of, I'm forgetting the name of it, a tiny town of less than 2,000, where there were 400 people at the protest. I mean, that's kind of huge. So, you know, we should be aware that people are moving, people are angry, people are mobilizing, and the issue of Palestine is not separate from that. You know, there was an issue at the protests that Palestine, Gaza was not included in the list of hands off. It was hands off a long list of things. It didn't say hands off Gaza, as it should have. But despite that, people showed up at virtually every one of these protests shouting for hands off Gaza. And what was amazing was that virtually everywhere, there may have been an exception or two, but virtually everywhere, no one objected. Everyone welcomed them and said, we're glad you're here. Maybe next time the people who called out the list will remember to include it. But in the meantime, people are taking their own initiative. And that's huge. And nobody objected. Nobody said, oh, you can't do this. This is too dicey, you know, we might get in trouble, or somebody might disagree. Maybe somebody did disagree, but they were keeping their mouth shut because they realized we're all in this together right now. And if we look at the protests that rose so spontaneously, so extraordinarily in the first weeks after the assault on Gaza began in October of 2023, where, you know, there's a movement for Palestinian rights that's been around for a long time. I was talking to somebody here tonight. We knew each other in Palestine back in the 80s, right? This is not a new issue. But what we saw in response to what was rapidly appearing to be genocide was the rise of a whole new movement. The Palestinian rights movement can't really claim that one. We didn't organize it. We helped a little bit, but it wasn't our doing. This was a spontaneous movement of people rising up and saying, this is not okay. This is not okay that our tax dollars, our name is being used to assault this tiny, crowded territory full of children and women and elders and men who have done nothing, who are living under decades of military occupation. This is not okay when we're seeing a genocide 24/7. Day after day after day, on our phones, on our computers, on our tablets, on our televisions, and our radio. And they're saying it's not okay, we need a ceasefire now. And that movement, I'm going to talk tonight a lot about movements, a little bit about what's going on the ground, but mostly about what we're doing about it and what needs to be done about it. At that moment, people in this ceasefire movement did two things that are both really pretty rare. The first is they maintained a level of what we might call message discipline that a lot of our movement, including the Palestine movement, I would say, are not so good at a lot of times. Everybody had the same demand: ceasefire now. And very quickly that meant not just now, but permanent. That's what's required. The second thing that this movement did, it managed to simultaneously maintain that discipline, ceasefire now, and redefine what a ceasefire has to include. Because it was no longer acceptable to just have an end to the bombing, an end to the tank fire, an end to the drone attacks. That had to be step one. Stop killing people with your weapons that we have given you and we have paid for and we have sold you. Stop it. That's only phase one. Number two of the ceasefire, at the same time, allow in massive amounts of humanitarian aid because people were starving very soon after the genocide began. Babies were dying. And that was not okay. That was not acceptable. That had to stop. And that was part of the ceasefire. And third, most of all important for our work here, stop sending the weapons. And that movement managed to do all those things as they looked around and said, I never worked on this issue before. I was an activist on climate change and on LGBTQ rights and on labor rights and on all these other things, but I never really thought much about this. Or I didn't really feel so comfortable with this. Or I was never an activist at all. I was living my little life with my family and I never really paid much attention to what was going on in the world. But somehow this was different. And so we had hundreds of thousands of people coming out into the streets week after week after week saying stop, saying ceasefire now. And that's an amazing statement about what political discourse has changed, how our country has changed. And this was all way before, remember, before the elections, before we were dealing with the challenges of our own country in the context of the Trump administration. So I think there's reason for hope. It's a challenge because this is an emergency situation and we don't have the time. This is a long-term project and we don't have long-term. People are dying. So we have to do two things simultaneously. We have to figure out ways of responding to the urgency of now, at the same time that we build a movement that over time can carry out the broad issues that so many of us care so much about, which is to end Israeli apartheid, to end settler colonialism, to end occupation. These aren't going to happen overnight, but we have to think about ending genocide overnight. We have to do both those things. So I think we're looking at an extraordinary moment. And the question of the moment, I think, also becomes really important. Because, you know, when we talk about trying to understand what's happening in the world today, in our country today, in our community today, and when we think about history, how we understand history, depends to a great degree on how we start the clock. When do we start the clock? In this situation, if we start the clock on October 7th of 2023, we're going to get one version of history. That something happened out of the blue. How could this have happened? Shocking, surprising, no basis, no understanding, this made no sense. That would be our understanding of the events that were quite horrific that happened on that day. If we start our clock on, say, 17 years later, 17 years earlier, in the year 2007, the year that Israel imposed a complete blockade on the Gaza Strip, walled it off into an open-air prison, stopped allowing in humanitarian aid, food, fuel, anything except in very tightly controlled amounts, we would get a very different understanding of history in terms of who were these people, who were these young men who carried out these acts, what had been their life for the last 17 years. Many of them were 19, 20, 25 years old. They had literally known nothing but life in an open-air prison. So we would understand those events that day very differently. If we went back to 1967, when Israel first imposed a military occupation on the Gaza Strip, along with the West Bank and occupied East Jerusalem and the Syrian Golan Heights and the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula, we would have still another view of history. And of course, if we go back to 1948, 75 years earlier, the Nakba, what Palestinians call the catastrophe, that Israelis call the War of Independence, that led to the expulsion and dispossession of their land of 750,000 Palestinians who left their homes holding the keys because they thought they'd be back in 3 weeks and would unlock the door to their homes they had locked because they were going to be gone for a few weeks. And now they have never been allowed to return. So this whole question of when you start the clock shapes everything about how we understand history and how we understand today. And that issue of stopping and starting the clock is a lot about why I wrote this book. Some of you may have seen this earlier book that Chuck referenced, the primer. This is not a new edition of that book, actually. It's based on that book in some ways. It has a lot, it's the same format, the FAQ format. But it's completely rewritten. There's a whole set of new sections. It's, you know, there's a long introduction. It's a very different book. And part of the reason is I was looking at this extraordinary new movement that we had never seen before. You know, in some ways similar to the movement that sprung up in response to the threat of war in Iraq almost 25 years ago. And this was after the vast majority of people in this country had welcomed war in Afghanistan after 9/11, despite the fact that none of the people who carried out that horrific attack were from Afghanistan. None were Afghans. They didn't train in Afghanistan. They trained in Florida. They didn't go to flight school in Afghanistan. They went to flight school in Minnesota. You know, it was like, what were we doing attacking a whole country that had not attacked us? But 88% of the people in this country agreed that that was a really good thing. But by the time it came a couple of years later to the war in Iraq, there was a spontaneous uprising that we saw coming to fruition, especially on February 15th, 2003. I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads. People in this room, there's a lot of people here old enough to remember you were all probably out in the streets that day, when somewhere between 14 and 16 million people around the world joined in the call, "The world says no to war." I was thinking of that as I watched this incredible movement rise in those first weeks after October 7th. Because it wasn't that there wasn't a movement working incredibly hard to build those movements and those protests. There were. But the rise of people was also spontaneous. And that, I think, also gives us hope. The other reason we have to be careful, and this is not so hopeful, the reason that when you start the clock is so important, you know, when I left on this sort of mini speaking tour around, because of this book, around New England, I was in, I don't know, 5 or 6 or 7 places in the last few days. Right before I left, I took some notes, partly because I wanted to get the numbers right. You know, you've all heard the numbers, that the number of people who we know have been killed by Israeli assault in Gaza since October 7th is close to 52,000. It's somewhere between 51 and 52,000. Those are only the people for whom we have their name, their birth date, and their ID number. So these are the confirmed deaths that we know the specifics. 17,000 of them are children. And we also know that since Israel broke the blockade, broke the ceasefire on March 18th, just since then, I wrote down 322 children, additionally, had been killed since that time. But then when I was in somewhere, Boston, 2 days ago. I looked it up just to be sure, and no, it was now 490 children had been killed just since the breaking of the ceasefire. I didn't look today to find out. Somebody did send me an email indicating that 46 Palestinians had been killed today. 49. I don't know how many of them were children. So this is what we are seeing. And this is why we have to simultaneously recognize the urgency and the need to do the educational work, the mobilization work that will last us for a long time, because we have a lot of work ahead. There's negotiations underway, and now they're not underway, then they are underway. I would say that none of that is going to matter until there is something that changes here in the United States. Until what has to happen for negotiations to work is that Israel has to say that the war will end. That it will not be a 2-week or a 2-month ceasefire when all the hostages get released and then we go back to war. Netanyahu said a couple days ago when he was at the White House that he had a 3-part goal, which is first to get all the hostages back, second to eliminate Hamas, which means virtually everybody, and then the remaining Palestinians would be voluntarily escorted out of Gaza. That's what ethnic cleansing looks like, right? So this is what we're now looking at. As long as that's his position, there's not going to be a ceasefire, right? It's not going to work. So what we have to be looking at is what is our role in that. You know, there was a lot of talk during the first months of the genocide about why is Netanyahu, why does he feel so emboldened? Why does he dare to just say no to his main sponsor, his funder, his armor? How does that happen? And you want to say, you know, have you looked at what the Biden administration and then later the Trump administration is doing, regardless of what they say? Why should anybody care about what they say rather than looking at what they do? So many times during the 18 months, well, during the first, whatever it was, 15 months of the genocide, President Biden expressed over and over again, you must stop killing so many Palestinians. It wasn't clear that they had to stop altogether, just not so many. Other times he said explicitly, I am heartbroken at a particular incident. I don't actually doubt that that's true. I think it is. He's a very emotional guy. We've seen that over and over again in all kinds of ways. I have no doubt that he is heartbroken. On the day that 7 humanitarian aid workers were killed in a 2-car convoy that was deliberately targeted by Israeli drones and killed them all, who worked for World Central Kitchen, 6 of them were internationals, only 1 was a Palestinian, unusual in that situation. Whether that had something to do with Biden's particular remark about it, I don't know, but whatever. He said, when it happened, I'm heartbroken at the news from this. I don't doubt that that was true. Anyone who saw it was heartbroken, right? But 8 hours later, the same day, he signed off on another $8 billion of weapons to Israel. So frankly, who gives a damn whether you're heartbroken or not? It does not matter. What matters is what you do. If you were heartbroken in a way that was going to mean something, it would have to mean, oh my God, what we have been doing is so wrong, we have to stop it. That's not what happened. We heard the words. So why should Bibi Netanyahu take that seriously? Because while the words kept changing, the weapons flow never did. Oh, sorry, one time it did. One batch of the 2,000 pounders, the biggest bomb other than a nuclear weapon in the US arsenal, was stopped for a few months. This is a bomb that one of them can wipe out the infrastructure and every human and non-human living, breathing being on an entire large city block. That was stalled. That was a good thing. It's not clearly enough. Those are already back in the pipeline. They're already going back. That's over. That little pause is over. But all the other weapons, whatever they have asked for, they have gotten. Whatever money they have needed, they have been given. Remember, before this crisis, Israel was already getting $3.8 billion a year, straight to the military. No restrictions, no conditions, $3.8 billion. Once this started, we were paying 40% of Israel's entire military budget. So that went from $17 billion the first year. It's now up to over 22, I think. I'm not positive on the number. It's about that. And it's rising. It's rising. There is no stopping the shipment of arms, except where people like us begin to stop it. How is that happening? Longshore workers all around the world in, let's see, in the Netherlands, in the United States on the West Coast, in a number of other places, longshore workers have refused to unload the ships. And after days of that, they can't unload. They go out back to sea, waiting for something to change. It's not clear what, but in the meantime, Israel's not getting those weapons. It's huge. It's one of the most important acts of international solidarity in the labor movement in a long time. This is enormous. So it comes back to what's our role in all of this. One of the things that I think is important here is that the understanding of what is the role of civil society and our social movements, the movement for Palestinian rights, the ceasefire movement, the uncommitted movement that played such an extraordinary role in the primary elections. All of that is part of this broader global struggle of taking responsibility to stop what's happening in Gaza, to stop a genocide, and to hold accountable those who are perpetuating it, right? So in that context, sorry. I've been doing too many speeches after chanting too much at the protests on Saturday. I know it was New Haven, it wasn't my hometown, but you know, wherever you are, you chant, so you know, what are you gonna do? I think that the question of the role of civil society is crucially important in whole new ways. And ironically, one of the moves by a government gives us the clue of what our next role is going to have to include, and that is the work that South Africa did to hold Israel accountable in the context of violating the Convention Against Genocide, bringing Israel to trial in the International Court of Justice in The Hague, right? This broke all kinds of taboos. The International Court of Justice is the UN court. It's the highest court in the world, sometimes called the World Court. The International Criminal Court is a different thing. It's an independent court. It has connections to the UN, but it's not the UN court. Countries can join it or not. A lot of countries are not members of it. The International Court of Justice applies to every country that's a member of the United Nations. Virtually every country in the world is a signatory to, is a participant in the International Court of Justice. And almost every country, actually, has also signed the Convention Against Genocide. And the Convention Against Genocide, also the Convention Against Apartheid, interestingly, the Convention Against Genocide is a very different animal than a lot of international law. A lot of parts of international law, any lawyers in the room? Good, we like that. Law students? Law students, there's still hope, but okay, nobody. A lot of international law is kind of designed to be completely opaque, so that nobody can really understand it. Even lawyers can't understand it half the time. It's long, drawn out with these Latin and Greek phrases, whatever. The Genocide Convention isn't that. It's really quite clear. And it gives you a very clear definition of what has to happen for an act of violence to be considered genocide. Because not every military attack, not every killing of even large numbers of people is necessarily genocidal. So you need two things. Number one, you need to intend to somehow destroy all or part of some group of people, determined by whether it's race, nationality, language, whatever it is, social identity, whatever, it can be any number of things, that you want to eliminate all or part of that group. The second part is you have to carry out at least one of 5 acts of violence against that group. So number 1 is killing people in the group. Number 2, injuring people. Number 3, creating conditions that make it impossible for a group to survive, right? So, you know, you could kill a lot of people, But if your intention is just to get the media to pay attention to you, that's not genocide. That's murder, major murder, but it's not genocide. If your goal is anything other than eliminating that group or part of the group, it's not genocide. But if you have both of those two things, the intention and one of those acts, then we're talking genocide. Genocide is always considered almost impossible to prove. Not because of the acts of violence. That's usually pretty obvious. It's usually large scale. You don't have to kill a single person. If you force people out of their homes, hello 1948, that can be genocidal. If your aim is to destroy that group, you don't have to kill any of them. But if you force them to disperse so that they are no longer a group, then you're committing genocide. In this case, it was very easy to find the specific intent, because Israeli officials of all kinds announced it. From the prime minister to the president to the minister of defense to the speaker of the Knesset to the head of one of the courts to you name it, they were out there talking about these people are animals. Yes, the children are included. There are no civilians in Gaza. These are pieces of evidence of intention. That when murder is carried out against them, that you are trying to do that. When somebody says there are no civilians, it means they all must be destroyed. Your intention is to destroy that group. You just announced it. So this was a lot easier to prove. Doesn't mean the work of the South African team, that extraordinary team, wasn't incredibly difficult. Did anybody here get up at 4 o'clock in the morning that day to watch the hearings in The Hague? Yeah, a couple of people did. It was one of the most amazing things to see. People all over the world were up at, well, for us it was 4 o'clock in the morning. It wasn't 4 o'clock in the morning everywhere, obviously. But people all over were watching this because why was it such a breaking of taboo? Not only was it the first time that in a serious way Israel was potentially going to be held accountable for its war crimes, its crimes against humanity, and potentially for genocide. That had never happened, despite years of Israeli actions like that. But also, the International Court of Justice, as was true of the United Nations itself, was not ever designed for an African country, a black African country, to take the initiative against the ally of the most powerful white colonial country around. That was not what it was there for. It was there to represent the interests of the white colonials, Europe and North America and Australia and New Zealand, etc. This was a double breaking of a double taboo, if you will. So when that happened at 4 o'clock in the morning, people are up and they're texting each other. A friend of mine in South Africa, I was on a text list, what do you call it? I don't know, a thread, a text thread, is that right? I don't text all that much on that kind of group. But, the text thread had people in South Africa and in Palestine and a couple of us in the US. And somebody wrote, I have never been so proud to be a South African, and I've never been so proud to be a human being. It was so powerful, you know? And that's part of what we're looking at. It's inspirational to say, okay, something can be done that has a chance to actually make this go away, to make this end. But we know the International Court of Justice does not have an army. You know that old saying that came from somebody in the US who was trying to justify going to war somewhere or sometime because they do it so frequently, we all forget which one it was, said, yeah, how many armies does the Pope have? This was kind of the same thing. How many armies does the International Court of Justice have? 0. You can also say, how many police do they have? None. They don't even have a process server who could like go around the world serving papers on somebody. They don't have anything like that. What they do have is the power of law, the power of international law as the most important court in the world. So what do? They issue an initial decision with saying that it is potentially, plausibly genocide, what Israel is doing, and that if it isn't, it may well lead to that. So it gives 6 orders, 6 provisional measures to the Israelis that they must follow. that start with stop carrying out any of those 5 bad things in the Genocide Convention, that starts with stop killing people against the people of Gaza. So it was essentially a ceasefire call, although they didn't use the word. Second one too, stop injuring people. So the order was made. And Israel says, are you kidding me? We're not going to abide by that. We don't take this seriously. We don't believe these judges. So what happens next? The court says it goes to the United Nations, which means first it goes to the Security Council, which is the most powerful part of the UN. But of course there's a US veto, so it's instantly vetoed. Everybody expects that. It takes less than a day. It's a few hours. Boom, it's done. Then it goes to the General Assembly. The General Assembly drafts an incredible, powerful resolution, including all the stuff that the court had called for, and says, you know, we're going to pass this resolution. At the same time, something else occurs that makes it even more powerful, which is the court makes a ruling on an old case from about 3 years earlier, when the General Assembly itself had asked the court for a legal opinion about whether Israel's entire occupation process, the whole thing, was legal or not. Because before that, it was like individual things might be illegal. It's illegal to demolish somebody's house. It's illegal to arrest children. Just, you know, specific items were considered illegal. But nobody had ever issued a ruling on the legality of this entire colonial project. Until July of 2024, the International Court of Justice issues their opinion. And they said it is completely illegal. All of the settlers must be removed as soon as possible. They must be evacuated within 1 year. They use the word evacuate. It was amazing. But again, the General Assembly doesn't have an army. So what happens to enforce both of those resolutions? Us, civil society. And here's where the model comes to us, again from South Africa. Almost everybody here, thankfully not everybody, but almost everybody here is old enough to remember the anti-apartheid movement of the 1980s. You don't have to raise your hand. Raise your hand if you don't. No, you don't really have to. But, you know, in the 1980s, it's starting in the 70s, but particularly into the 80s, all over the world, there's this rising anti-apartheid movement. And people are putting incredible levels of pressure on their own governments to impose sanctions on apartheid South Africa. Banking sanctions, corporate sanctions, the SWIFT code of the international banking system pulls South Africa out of it. Ultimately, the sports boycotts, all those things. And that's happening, country after country after country, because people in those countries are holding up this incredible resolution of the General Assembly, based on the International Court, that say every country should stop selling arms to Israel. Every country should stop all trade with Israel. Every country should downgrade their diplomatic relations with Israel. It went farther than the BDS movement ever dreamed of. And here's people all over the world saying, we demand you do this, protesting in the capitals. And it starts to work. Country after country across Europe and in Latin America, all over the place. Governments start imposing sanctions on South Africa. And eventually, there's enough countries that the US actually pays attention to, which means its trade partners and its political allies in NATO and whatnot. They all start to do it. So eventually, the work that had been going on for years in this country, led by the Black Caucus of the Congress, which at the time was known for being the conscience of the Congress, had tried and tried and tried and failed and tried again, and suddenly they won. And yes, the president, Ronald Reagan, vetoed it, and yes, they were able to override the veto within a week. So this was an enormous victory that played a huge role in the overthrow of apartheid. This is the lesson for all of us now. This is what we have to be doing. The decision of the International Court is just the preliminary decision. It's going to be a long time, unfortunately, before they issue a full finding on the genocide, on what the punishments should be, all of that. But in the meantime, we have a binding preliminary resolution to be our tool, to take to our government and demand that. In California, around the same time as the ICJ hearing was underway, we found CCR and other lawyers, the National Lawyers Guild, Palestine Legal, collaborating to bring to trial, to bring charges against President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken for complicity in Israeli genocide in Gaza. And the judge did something extraordinary. This is in U.S. federal court in California. And the judge took several days to rule on the motion to dismiss, where the government in this case came in and said, you don't have to take this up. This is our business. This is foreign policy. You don't have any business doing this. You should dismiss this case outright. And the judge took several days and issued an extraordinary opinion that said, unfortunately, because of the legal restrictions on the difference between the judicial and executive branches, I can't rule on the substance of this case. I have to throw it out. I have to accept the motion to dismiss. However, he went on for, I think, 50 pages, something like that, saying that the evidence I have seen, the witnesses I have heard, the victims' statements that have been brought before me provide every indication that this is indeed a genocide. This was extraordinary. This had never happened before. So we're seeing these incredible moves forward from the courts, who we've all been so frightened would cower in the face of the pressure from the White House today, but even earlier. And particularly what we're seeing with how they're using the courts, how they're using immigration to threaten students, particularly students who are trying to defend Palestinian rights and say no to genocide. And what is the response? If you're not a citizen of this country, suddenly you don't have the right of free speech anymore. When not only the Constitution says that everyone, not every citizen, everyone has that right, and the famous court case in the Supreme Court of Harry Bridges. I think people here, if anybody's a labor historian, know well the story of Harry Bridges, the head of the longshore workers. They have been heroic before this. Harry Bridges' case, they tried to throw him out of the country. He was here as a naturalized citizen. They said it would be revoked because he was seen to be associating with people who might be members of the Communist Party. They didn't even claim he was a member of the Communist Party, because apparently he wasn't. But that didn't seem to matter. It was very much like this. But the Supreme Court, to their great credit at that time, a long time ago, said the Constitution is very clear. This is a right of free speech for everybody in the world, everybody in the country, not only citizens. And Harry Bridges was allowed to stay in the United States. So what we're seeing right now, in some ways, and I think part of the reason we're seeing such consistency in this ceasefire movement, in this movement of outrage over what the genocide in Gaza means, is that this is now an issue of free speech for everyone in this country. This is no longer just an issue of international solidarity, as crucial and important and morally necessary for us. This is also about our own rights at home. Because it's not just students who happen to be out of status, or who maybe took one unit too few one semester, or who are technically in violation of one thing or another. It isn't just that. It's those students who stood up for Palestinian rights who are being the first ones targeted. Now they're going after others, as we knew they would. But the first were those who stood up for Palestinians, because they were seen as being the most vulnerable. Because really, who would stand up for that? Well, it turns out a lot of people are standing up for them. Not the administrators of their universities, we should note. They are not standing up for them. And this is a crime. This is an outrage. If you all remember, in 2017, the first time Trump was elected, one of the first things he did was the Muslim ban. Remember the Muslim ban? Thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in cities across the country flooding the airports to protest the Muslim ban, to welcome Muslims into this country, to say we will not allow a Muslim ban. And the universities were at the front of the line, with university presidents saying, we will not allow you to touch our students. You are not going to throw our students out of the country. We'll be damned if we'll allow that. Universities must be a bastion of protection of free speech and the right of free engagement with ideas. I don't know where those people are now, but they sure are not heading up the universities I see. There's a couple, there's a few, but mostly really not so much. And in that context, it's also not surprising that they're starting with the Ivies, right? Because then imagine some small community college in a small town somewhere who gets some of their students notified, or maybe they don't even get notified. They get picked up by ICE with no notification in a kidnapping, like what happened to the young woman at Tufts, walking down the street, walking home from an iftar dinner towards her dorm, and there's suddenly 6 people around her dressed in black with hoodies and masks, no identification, no way of knowing who they were, who grab her, handcuff her, and she screams, "Who are you people? Let me go." And they bundle her into an unmarked car and ship her off to, what was the place? Yeah. St. Albans, Vermont, yeah. And then to Louisiana. This is kidnapping. This is the act of a fascist regime. And these schools, only now, Tufts is actually issuing a good statement. How far they'll go, we'll see. But for most universities, most colleges, smaller colleges in particular, they're looking at this and saying, my God, if Harvard can't protect their students, how are we supposed to? We better just collapse, because otherwise they'll shut down our whole school. You know, if Princeton can't, if UPenn can't, if Yale can't, what are we supposed to do? And then we get to Columbia, the poster child for whatever you want to call it, cowardice. The poster child for cowardice. If you haven't read it, I recommend you take a look at the extraordinary article, I'm not sure where it was published actually, but it's easy to find online, by Rashid Khalidi, who for many years held the Edward Said Chair that led the Center for Palestinian Studies at Columbia University. He was one of their leading lights, one of the professors they were the most proud of, who they paraded around as evidence of good scholarship that they were. And he retired last year. And he just wrote this extraordinary piece saying Columbia is should no longer be called a university. That they used to call it, I forget what they used to call it, but he said what it should be called is Vichy on the Hudson. That's a powerful indictment for someone of his stature. Our movement is stronger because our own rights are at stake. That's not necessarily something by itself that we should be proud of. But it is a reality anywhere, that when people's own rights are also at stake, it's easier to build a movement against the violation of rights that our government is carrying out somewhere else, right? So it's not a surprise that one of the most potent arguments for ending, whether it's aid to Israel or war in anywhere else around the country that you want to talk about, is that our military budget, which is now very close to $1 trillion, 52% of the entire discretionary budget of this country goes directly to the military, and half of it goes directly to the corporations that manufacture the warplanes and the drones and the bombs and the tanks. Given all of that, why do we not think there's an impact on our own ability to provide health care for all, to provide education, to provide jobs? So it affects everybody in this country, but poor people more than anybody else. So we're fighting for the poorest sector of our own population when we fight to end military spending and military adventures abroad. So our work for Palestinians, our work for ending genocide, our work to defend international law, which was on its way to oblivion in this country, has everything to do with, when you start the clock, understanding and remembering that history and combining our movements so that our movement for Palestinian rights is part of the movement against the expulsion of refugees, announcing that the only refugees that will be allowed in are white South African Afrikaners. No other refugees from anywhere else in the world. I mean, this is like somebody's idea of a bad joke, except that it's not funny, because it is the position of the US government at this point. They are allowing in no other refugees. As it happens, hardly any Afrikaners have any interest or intention of coming. I'm sure the South Africans would be delighted if they did, but But this is a reality. And when we deal with it, we have the almost advantage, if you will, of reminding people that the cost of what we are spending on arms to Israel is coming out of the ability to provide SNAP for the poor people among us. It's coming out of Medicare, not just Medicare for all, But Medicare for some, like right now, we may lose that. It's coming out of Medicaid for old people and young people and people with disabilities who depend on that. That's where the money is coming from. It's not going to come from the billionaires. It's coming because the billionaires want a tax cut, and they're going to get it if this continues. So all of that is part of our job. And our role on that South African model is at the core of it, because enforcement of accountability is the most important part. There is an importance to the moral and political and legal assertion that Israel is, at this moment, potentially, plausibly, from my view, certainly, committing genocide. That is important, but it by itself is not enough. Until they are forced to take responsibility for that and stop it and begin the process of what massive efforts it's going to take from all of us all around the world to make good on the lives that have been so destroyed, to rebuild whatever can be rebuilt for a people that has been so damaged. So we have a lot of work to do. And I think, there's an old saying from Tacitus, the great Roman writer, who during one of the, I think it was the Peloponnesian Wars, looked out and he said, the Romans brought devastation and they called it peace. There is the danger that that is what our country will do. It's done it in Iraq, it's done it in Afghanistan, destroy the country and call it peace. This is what Trump wants to do in Gaza. Expel all the people, destroy the land, and create a Mediterranean Riviera paradise. It will not be peace. There will be no peace without justice. Thank you.
Wow, amazing. So we're so lucky to be able to take questions now of Phyllis. So I think the way we're gonna do this, and before I do that, I'll just intro myself really briefly. My name's Samia, for those who don't know me. I'm with Southern Vermont for Palestine. And just a reminder to folks that the groups that supported this event are down in the lobby. So after this, please come talk to us if you'd like to. Phyllis's book is down in the lobby as well. So please purchase one if you haven't already. And so for questions, Fisher and I, and I'll let Fisher intro themselves in a moment, are going to attempt to moderate. And I think what that's going to mean is we'll take a group of like 2-3 questions and then allow Phyllis to kind of pull out the thematic things that she wants to answer. We'll do a round of the live folks, and we'll also check in with the folks online and make sure we get a good couple rounds of questions in. Fisher, please.
Great. I was going to just try to buy us time until we found the second microphone, which we have. So, hi all. I am Alex Fisher, representing Jewish Voice for Peace. And yeah, Sammy and I will be coming around. If you have a question, raise your hand. We will slowly make our way to you. Try to be as succinct and clear, because Phyllis is going to be writing down 3 or 4 questions at a time, and then we'll kind of do a thematic answering.
Okay, cool. So I start up here.
Perhaps a small step that those people who have public personality and have a forum such as yourself may be able to take to move this discussion forward and perhaps eliminate the accusation of anti-Semitism that sweeps across anybody who's interested in justice for Palestine. Perhaps folks with a platform finally, once and for all, loudly and clearly acknowledge the unacknowledged fact that Palestinians are Semites. And speak to that loudly and clearly and over in a large way, that those people who are opposed to justice for Palestinians are truly practicing anti-Semitism.
You guys saw, yeah, right here. Oh, back here. I think you see them as well. Take it plus.
I'd be interested in hearing your view, your look at the Palestinian situation through the lens of Manifest Destiny and what we did to our own indigenous population.
I heard bits of a piece on the radio when I was driving about how all of law derives from land. The crux of all law is land. And this stealing of land and contention and conflict over land and walling lands off that traditionally belong to the Palestinians, all that sort of thing. And I would ask you to talk a little bit about land in this. Houses and lives are important, but it's the land that's motivating.
Is that enough for now? Yeah.
Okay. Very interesting questions. Let me just say quickly on the first one, because that's a rather short answer, actually. I've talked about that a lot, actually, this question that Palestinians are Semites, Arabs are Semites, many Jews are not Semites. And it's the wrong term. But I actually don't think that's necessarily a very, it's not a very significant way. It's not that it's not significant. To me, it's not a useful way of bringing more people into understanding the problems of what Israel is doing. The word anti-Semitism has been grounded so long to mean anti-Jewish prejudice that trying to struggle for a new definition of that, to me, seems like a side issue. I don't see it as that useful. So for me, it's a transactional question. I agree with you. It's absolutely true. Arabs are Semites, and many Jews are Arabs in that sense. In Israel, it's probably still a majority of the Jewish population are Semites because they're from Arab countries. But I don't think it's that useful a thing, because I don't think it gets to the root of what we're talking about here. I appreciate it because I think too few people even ever think about it. The issue of the weaponization with false claims of anti-Semitism is a hugely important part, because it's one of the main features that undermines our work. And that is crucial, and it has to do with this claim that all criticism of Israel necessarily is anti-Semitic, which of course we know is not true, but it takes a lot of discussion with people, and we have to have those discussions when it's one-on-one and sometimes in big groups as well, to say that this is simply false, that Israel is a wealthy, powerful, nuclear-armed state that has to be held accountable to the same international law as anyone else, and that anti-Semitism in this country is on the rise. Real anti-Semitism is on the rise. And we saw that in Pittsburgh in 2018 with the killing of 11 Jewish worshipers at their prayer. We saw it in Charlottesville, thank you, when we saw the tiki torches with people chanting, "Jews will not replace us." We saw it in San Diego when Jews were attacked. Real anti-Semitism is on the rise and is threatening Jews as Jews. Not Jews because of Israel, but Jews as Jews because of racism. Where does this come from? It comes from the far-right white supremacist movement. The rise of modern anti-Semitism parallels the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. That's why people like Leo Frank, a Jewish shopkeeper, was lynched in the same era that so many African Americans were lynched in the early 20th century. Never as many, never suffered the level of extreme repression that African Americans in this country suffered. But anti-Semitism was on the rise, and it was taken up by the Klan. So we need to be responsible, and organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace do that brilliantly, to simultaneously take up the work of challenging real anti-Semitism and demanding that there be a recognition that criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism. And on college campuses, what we see is that the act of making some, not even close to all, not even close, maybe not even half, of Jewish students uncomfortable by challenging some idea they have grown up with is the same as threatening them. It's not the same. Colleges are designed to challenge people, to challenge your ideas that you grow up with. You know, when I was a Jewish kid in California growing up, being Jewish meant supporting Israel. It's kind of all there was. That was the only, you know, yeah, we didn't challenge it particularly. You know, I was very active in that movement. I learned a lot about organizing, actually. And now, particularly among young people, the justice generation that came of age politically, and maybe it was 2014 with the murder no, not George Floyd, that was in 2020, Mike Brown in Ferguson, or 2020 with George Floyd, came of age in a moment when the streets were filled with people saying, no, we will not accept this kind of police brutality against young black people in our country. And young Jews grew up into that movement and said, maybe being Jewish isn't just about supporting Israel, it's about social justice. And maybe we should be part of this movement for Palestinian rights because it's part of the movement for racial justice. Right? So all of that is crucial to our work. So I really appreciate you raising the issue of anti-Semitism, because while I often talk about it in presentations, I don't always, and it's always good to be reminded of it. The other two questions are actually quite related, which is the question of manifest destiny and the question of land. Manifest destiny is about settler colonialism. It's about moving onto land to settle there. It's about what the Catholic Church always called the doctrine of discovery, that said any Christian who discovers a piece of land that is populated by people who are not Christians has the right to take it. And as of a few years ago, that was still the official position of the Catholic Church. Pope Francis, responding to a group of indigenous folks from across the Americas, and including some others, including Reverend William Barber from the Poor People's Campaign and others, who went to meet with him. They didn't ultimately meet with Francis, but they met with his top guys. They were told there wasn't exactly an apology, but there was a statement that this no longer, it was a distancing, let's put it that way, which is important. It was a step. No, they had never made that step before in whatever it was, 500 years. So this was like a good thing. Not enough, but a good thing. But the point is that settler colonialism is a particular kind of colonialism. It's not the most common kind of colonialism, which is sending troops, sending forces to gain control of a certain part of a territory to gain their resources, whether it's to steal their oil, to find water, to capture people to enslave. It could be any of those things. Settler colonialism is about land. It's about taking the land and expelling or killing or enslaving the native population. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about manifest destiny and settler colonialism. For the United States, the choice of getting rid of an annoying indigenous population was extermination, both directly and through wiping out. Here we come to the definition of genocide. Remember, creating conditions that make it impossible for them to survive. That was the destruction of the buffalo for the Plains Indians. They didn't have to kill them all. They just killed what they depended on for survival. They killed plenty directly. The Sand Creek Massacre. Did I already mention the Sand Creek Massacre tonight? No. Okay, that was last night, sorry. The Sand Creek Massacre is one of the great models of what this looks like, right? A military force from the US, led by a Methodist minister, in fact, is out hunting Indians, as he described it. And they get to Sand Creek, and there's a village camped on the shores, and he orders his troops to kill everyone in the village. And they come back, and they said, some of them just went to do it. Some of them came back and said, this is a peaceful village. There's women, there's kids, there's old people. And he said famously, nits make lice, kill them all. This is the language of Sand Creek. This is the language of today's Knesset. It's the same language. The children will grow up to become little snakes. That was the words of one of the Israeli officials. So this is about land. You want to get rid of the people who live there. The US chose extermination of the population. The Israelis chose expulsion, get them off the land. Plenty died, not as nearly as many as have died in Gaza in this last 18 months were killed in the Nakba. But they were expelled, leaving the land for the colonial forces who would come. In South Africa, it was to capture the labor of the indigenous forces. They didn't want to get rid of them. They wanted to control them and use their labor to make the colonial forces, the white forces, rich. So, there's choices of what settler colonial countries do, and it's different than other kinds of colonialism. And it comes back to the issue of land. Just in passing, on the issue of law, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know if that's kind of an understanding of law. My own understanding is it's a lot about law, about land, but I can't say that it's only, because I think laws that prohibit people from killing people, for instance, are important laws. I think those are important, and they don't necessarily get reflected in the issue of land. So I'm not sure about how that works. But in the question of Palestine, this is all about land. This is not about religion. This is not about a conflict between two racial groups or something. This is about land. So that is absolutely important.
Some questions from the live stream. We had about 40 people watching. One question, there's two questions. One, what do you think can be done to amplify the power of the ICJ, particularly in the face of so much criticism of the UN from all sides? A lot of the critique of the UN is that it's simply an instrument of Western empire. Second question, what strategies do you think could be most effective to ensure that the Palestinian cause is more included within the broader anti-fascist movement? It seems like there is at best hesitancy and at worst resistance to including the liberation of Palestine.
Also really good questions. The first, on the question of amplifying the role of the ICJ, we legitimize the ICJ. It's not like the ICJ legitimates the Palestinian understanding that this is genocide. It's that we are legitimating the work of the ICJ and making it important. The problem of the UN, and US domination of the UN, is a long-standing problem, and it's very real. I wrote a book called Calling the Shots, How Washington Dominates Today's UN. I wrote that, the first edition came out in 1995, which was allegedly the era of multilateralism, right? That was the Clinton administration, everybody loved the UN, blah, blah, blah. But the reality was complete US domination at that time. Now, it's like a whole different level. It's even worse. What happened with the decision-making of the ICJ, of the International Court, these are 15 judges who are elected in this sort of complicated, both regional and global process. Both the General Assembly and the Security Council has to approve them. It's a very complicated process. But they're from 15 different countries that have 15 different kinds of legal systems, right? The president of the court during that period was the US judge. And in theory, all the judges serve as individuals, as legal scholars. They are not accountable to their governments. They're not picked by their governments. They're not paid by their governments. They are nominated by their governments. So there's that. And they serve for 3 years, sometimes an additional 3 years, and then they go back and live in their country. So they want to get a job. They want to be on some corporate board. They want to be appointed a judge somewhere, So there's always the assumption that the judge from Germany is going to vote the way Germany functions and the way Germany votes at the UN. We were all really scared about the US judge in the International Court, because she had worked at the State Department for a long time. She wasn't known as some right-wing, hawkish, whatever. She was a kind of normal, liberal, something judge, and we were still scared, right? And it turned out that the judges in this case, with one exception, basically did what they're supposed to do. They voted as judges, as scholars. There were, I think, about 10 or 15 separate, they're not charges exactly, but they're sections that they had to vote on. And in each one, when she read this long decision, the judge read what the vote was. Most of them were, well, and I should say there were 2 additional judges who were participating, because the way the court works is that of the 2 countries that are at, this was a case brought by South Africa against Israel. There was not either an Israeli or a South African judge on the court. So each of them gets to appoint someone to serve as a judge. So it's one of these things, you know how they're going to vote, but they are considered part of the team of judges just for that case. So all of them were either 2 or at the most 3 votes against, with 15 votes in favor. So it was the Israeli judge and, wait for it, the Ugandan judge who voted against every single one. The Ugandan judge was like a mystery until people realized who she was. She's a very strong Christian Zionist believer in Zionism. She's written about it, etc. She basically just said the law doesn't apply. So she accepted the Israeli arguments that said that the law doesn't apply to this and voted against all of them. But the US judge voted for virtually everyone. I think she was one of the opponents on one issue, but virtually all of them. As was true, there was a couple of Europeans. This was a pretty mixed court. And it was extraordinarily not a close vote. So that's an encouraging thing, that they took it far more seriously than anybody thought they would. The broader question isn't easy to answer. I did write this book about it, but then I later wrote a book that was about how the UN and some governments, for their own opportunist reasons, and social movements all around the world, built a movement against war in Iraq, which ultimately didn't stop the war from happening, but it did ensure that it was understood to be illegal. It probably stopped the US from going to war against Iran 5 years later, and it accomplished a number of other pretty important things. So I think that while the problem of US domination, and the domination, frankly, of the veto-wielding powers themselves, I mean, the Brits and the French basically don't use them very often. The Brits do on occasion with the US for Israel, but rarely. But China and Russia on occasion do too. Having those 3 giant powers with the veto power is horrifying. It's a huge failure of the UN, and it was designed that way. It was designed to be that. So it's not an answer to say that the ICJ makes it all okay. It doesn't. But it does mean that the UN, when it is claimed by social movements who move to defend it, so for example, in the context of the genocide, Jewish Voice for Peace protested at the UN in 2 ways. They occupied the Security Council chamber, kind of by chance that they happened to get in. That wasn't on the agenda. The door was open. They said, "Can we go in?" And they said, "Sure." And they sat down and began to pray. These were rabbis. Sorry, this was not Jewish Voice for Peace. I take that back. It was Rabbis for Ceasefire. Rabbis for Ceasefire, which had been created in the context of the genocide. They occupied it for about an hour. It was with banners and all of that. And then they asked for and got a separate meeting with the Secretary General to say to him, not, we're here to condemn what the UN is doing, but we're here to say that we do not support what our government is doing to prevent the UN from doing its job. And tell us how we can help. How can we help the UN do its job because our government is preventing it? Which, trust me, the Secretary General does not hear very often, and he certainly doesn't hear it from a bunch of rabbis. So this was pretty special. So that, again, it comes back to us. We're the ones that have to make the UN something viable. And the question of strategy comes back to the same thing. What we have to do is partly about the work to create movements that will demand a ceasefire with this broad 3-part understanding of what a ceasefire has to look like. And when, in the context of the movement against fascism that is rising in this country, that's what I talked about at the beginning. And I'll repeat it now. I think that what we saw on Saturday was an important indication. It's true that the issue of Gaza, the issue of Palestinian rights, was not included. There were other things that were not included too, but this is the most important thing that the movement has been responding to for the last 18 months, and it's outrageous. that it was not included in the list of hands-off. Hands-off Medicare, hands-off Social Security, hands-off education, hands-off unemployment. All of those things should have said hands-off Gaza. And it didn't, and that's a big problem. But one thing that we have going for us now is that we have evidence that it's not political suicide to criticize Israel the way so many, particularly in Congress, used to think. Some of the unions used to think that. Nobody thinks that anymore. I mean, some people still do. A lot of people claim it as an excuse why not to support Palestinian rights. But we have polls on our side. Any one poll is nothing but a snapshot. But when you have poll after poll going in one direction, that trajectory is something you can't really ignore. So if we look at 2021, there's a poll taken by the Jewish Electorate Institute. Jewish voters across the country, 25% said Israel is an apartheid state. 38% of young Jews said the same thing. 2023, 44% said Israel of Democrats said Israel is like apartheid. This is not Jews, this is all Democrats. And now we look at today's votes. It was a couple of months ago. 77% of voters in the Democratic Party want no more aid to Israel. That's huge. That's never happened before. That's enormous. And that's a tribute to all the work that the Palestinian rights movement has been doing for 35, 40, 50 years, and the work of the ceasefire movement for the last 18 months, and the work of the uncommitted movement for a 6-month window right in the middle of all that. It's a tribute to all of that. So we need to work with the leadership, and many of us are part of the leadership. Our organizations, many of us work in organizations that are not specific only to Palestine, but we work on many different issues. And we need to have those conversations and say, look, we know in the past it's been very controversial. People have paid a political price. That's real. We can't deny that. It's not like that anymore. There's also the moral argument that it never should have been enough. The fact that you're going to pay a political price is not an excuse for not doing the right thing. But we don't have to be blaming people right now. We have to come together. This is a moment where we are in such grave danger. Because remember, what fascism looks like in this country is not going to look like it did in Nazi Germany. It's not going to look like Chile in the 1970s after the coup by Pinochet. It's going to look very different. But in a lot of countries around the world that the US supports, it's going to look just like Nazi Germany. It's going to look just like Pinochet's Chile. So our obligation in fighting against genocide goes to an internationalist obligation as well. We can't afford to antagonize people who may have thought, oh God, it was too controversial. And keep in mind, as I said earlier, virtually every protest that happened last Saturday had some kind of a Palestinian presence. An official contingent, a speaker, some kids with flags, some people with great chants, whatever it was, and overwhelmingly they were welcomed. There's one report I saw about people from the leadership coming, you guys really shouldn't be here, you weren't invited, whatever. Okay, that's out of something like 1,500 protests. That speaks to the normalization of Palestinian rights within our movement. Is it over and done and we can just, assume it's not an issue anymore? Absolutely not. We have to build those ties. The people that organized the Palestinian rights hands-off Palestine demonstration on the same day in Washington, D.C., to say we need to have a national Palestinian rights presence in this, since it's not part of the other one, they did a beautiful job. They divided people into contingents, students contingent, Jewish contingent, 6 of them, and had people fan out into different parts of the big march against fascism that was going on in Washington. Not to challenge it, not to say, why don't you people have us there? Were there some incidents like that? Maybe. I wasn't there. Where was I? I was in New Haven, yes. So I don't know. But certainly there wasn't any big opposition, because we certainly would have heard about it if there was. So this is where we are. We need to consolidate that part. We need to make sure that the issue of Palestine is within and not outside of the movement against fascism, because you can't build a movement against fascism while your government is carrying it out in some other place. So I'm much more optimistic than I'm afraid the person online may have been, because while everything they said is true, it's changing. And that's what we have to look forward to. Maybe one more set.
One more?
One more set, yeah.
We're past the 8 p.m. mark.
And remember, there's books out there that are waiting for you.
Nancy and then Isaac.
Okay, my question is, at this moment, it feels like, well, we know it's true, that the current fascist government has decided that what courts say doesn't matter to them at all. And it can...
I can repeat it. We're hearing that the government in power now is saying that what happens in court doesn't matter.
And it feels like they're being backed up by the completely, amazingly corrupt Supreme Court to not follow the law. So I'm just wondering, you know, we're trying to challenge them, but I'm just wondering, you've been doing this a long time, as have I, but you obviously know more than I do. What can we do then? I'm so frustrated. What can we do?
About the courts. Okay, next question.
No, the governor refusing to follow the law.
Okay.
Hi Phyllis, Isaac here with Action Corps. We've emailed about Yemen. Thanks for coming to Brattleboro. I was wondering if you would speak briefly to what the U.S. is doing unconstitutionally in Yemen in terms of the bombing of the country and how that relates to Gaza.
Briefly.
And also just people in this room played an important role with getting Becca Balint, our congresswoman, to call for a ceasefire last fall, and then also right here in Brattleboro, getting Bernie to commit to introducing this joint resolution of disapproval against the weapons sales to Israel last summer. I'm just interested in your thoughts on what our congressional delegation can do. Thanks.
Okay. One more for, make it 3? All right.
I just wanted to thank you for your lifetime of advocacy and service beyond your country for the people of Palestine. I tooled this over my head a bit, but I'm going to try to make it as succinct as possible. Is there any way, have you found any way to reach the people that are in our lives that I meet with over tea who just don't want to listen, who just don't want to understand that humanity? Thank you again so much.
Great. Okay. So the question of the courts being too soft and the government saying they won't listen anyway, I don't think any of that is clear yet. We've seen examples of it. We've seen other examples. We saw today, actually I just read it today, it happened last night, 7 o'clock last night, the judge in the case of the person who was expelled to El Salvador, the Venezuelan. I think that the judge said that, oh God, I'm going to get this wrong. The judge said that they would require, within 24 hours, the government had to, oh no, sorry, this is for Mahmoud Khalil's case. Yeah, it's for Mahmoud Khalil's case. The judge was told the government they have to produce within 24 hours evidence of why his actions were a threat to U.S. foreign policy. And if they didn't, he intended to release him, which is huge. Now, you know, there's all kinds of questions. He might order the jailer to do that, and the jailer says, no, that could happen, but we haven't seen any evidence of that ever happening yet. So that's one thing. We've seen the Supreme Court come down differently than was expected in a number of these cases. Most of the cases have not yet gone up to the Supreme Court. Most of them are not yet at the Court of Appeals. One of the things that's been extraordinarily different and encouraging this time around is that there have been charges brought to oppose every one of these actions within hours of when it happens. There are lawyers that have mobilized across the country, 2 big coalitions of lawyers. One is the National Lawyers Guild and the Center for Constitutional Rights and Paralegal and Law Forward. The other one is the ACLU, and they're all working together, and there are lawyers everywhere. Some of the universities that are doing the right thing, those few of them, are having lawyers on call 24/7 for any of their students who get picked up by ICE or threatened by ICE. So all of this stuff, it may turn out to be not enough. We don't know that. We can't guarantee that yet. But we certainly are not in a position where we can say that it's hopeless and that the courts are useless and it's not going to work. That's just not the case. We're seeing victories. We're seeing victories. And, you know, one example, which is a great one and a scary one at the same time, many of you will remember the Los Angeles 8 case. 7 Palestinians and a Kenyan woman who was married to one of the Palestinians who were picked up for immigration violations based on the old McCarran-Walter Act, the McCarthy-era statute that said you can deport anyone who is a supporter of communism. And that's what they were charged with, supporting an organization that supports world communism. It was one of the factions of the PLO. They were students, they were Palestinian students. 5 of them were in a Debka group, that seemed to be their main work. You know, they were passing out literature from one of the factions of the PLO. And it took 21 years. They were held, you know, they were arrested by the FBI at gunpoint, huge headlines in the LA Times, terrorist nests found across the city. It was a huge big deal. They were in jail for 23 days. And finally the judge said, this is ridiculous, I'm setting them loose. There's no evidence here. It took 21 years for them to win that case. But they did win it. They weren't in jail. They lived their lives. They couldn't leave the country. They grew up, they married, they had kids. They couldn't introduce their kids to their parents back in Palestine. Their parents passed, they couldn't go to the funeral. It was torture. But they set a precedent. And that becomes, on the one hand, a great model that it pays off to fight. It's awful because it took 21 years. I don't think that's going to happen this time. I think decisions are going to be made sooner. Some of them may not work. There's no guarantee here that we're going to win all these cases. But the fact that people are fighting them before it ever gets to court, before somebody gets pulled into court, have there been misses? Yeah, the 200 people that were shipped off to the prison in El Salvador because nobody knew about it. They weren't listed, all of those. Hugely problematic. But now the courts are saying that's not acceptable, so the chances of it happening again are pretty slim. Doesn't mean they're not going to come up with other crazy-ass with other, you know, awful things they're going to do. But this is what we have, I think, to look forward to. On the question of the Vermont court, you guys get Bernie. That's been so incredibly important. The JRDs, it was a huge victory when we had 19 senators saying yes to the joint resolutions of disapproval. That has never been envisioned before on the question of military aid to Israel. It sounds like nothing, right? There's 100 senators, 19 senators, what's that? Well, that happens to be 40% of the entire Democratic caucus of the Senate, which is half the Senate. That's not nothing. That was a victory. Wasn't a good enough victory because it didn't win. Victories never win the first time around. And we lost back. We're now at 15 in the last time. The next one maybe will be 25. Maybe the tour that AOC and Bernie are doing around the country, including the work of Chuck and my colleague our colleague Sarah Anderson, who work on the inequality work at IPS, are helping to put all that together. Maybe that'll help. People around the country are starting to put more pressure on their own members of Congress. There's sit-ins going in. On Saturday, there were a bunch of protests at the offices of senators and members of Congress. There were also members of Congress, I don't know about senators, maybe they were too, that were out with the protesters. In New York, they didn't let any of them speak. They didn't let anybody speak, actually, which is, you know, a different issue. Some people thought that was terrible. I seem to think it was a good idea, actually. But, you know, this is a new moment when the level of unity of people who are in opposition to so many things that this government is doing is bringing people together and not driving them apart. That's what's so important here. People who are fighting to keep a Department of Education because we know that our kids with special needs, disabled kids, and poor kids need that, are working with the people that are trying to protect Social Security, who are working with the people that are trying to make sure that the military budget gets cut. They're not working against each other. They're not competing with each other. They're collaborating. They're cooperating. This is what we have to do. Palestine is part of it. We have to take them seriously, treat people as our colleagues and comrades and friends. With the people, the last part of this answer is for the people who just don't want to hear it. There's a great resource on the Jewish Voice for Peace website, which is how to talk to your crazy uncle so-and-so at Thanksgiving, how to talk to your family who doesn't want to hear what you have to say about Israel and Palestine. It also applies to people who are not your family. So take a look at that. It's a hard one. It's not easy. Breaking with Zionism is not easy. It's a hard job, but it's part of what we do. And it comes back to the question of morality. This is our money, our government operating in our name. Is that what we want the rest of the world to see in us? I don't think so. Thank you.
rahmet et marmara